Ethan Caldwell never believed the quiet corners of a workplace could hide anything sinister. But his first night as a janitor inside the old municipal building would prove him wrong. Hidden staircases, flickering hallways, and a silence so heavy it seemed alive drew him deeper than his mop and bucket ever should have taken him. What began as routine cleaning soon twisted into a waking nightmare, where shadows moved with intention and every locked door seemed to be hiding something that desperately wanted out. The building was always silent by the time I arrived. My shift began when the last employees had gone home, when the hum of computers had died down and the echo of footsteps no longer filled the hallways. As a janitor, I was used to the solitude. I told myself it was better this way, easier to work without interruptions, without anyone glancing at me as though I were part of the background. Most nights I found comfort in the stillness, but there was something about this particular building that made the silence feel different. It wasn't peaceful silence. It was heavy, pressing down on me as if the walls themselves were listening. I pushed my mop bucket down the long basement corridor, the wheels squeaking against the tiles. The faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above me echoed in the empty space. I always started in the basement because no one liked to come down here during the day. It smelled faintly of damp concrete and rust, and the narrow hallway stretched longer than it should, bending out of sight. Even though I had been here countless times, I never felt comfortable. My skin prickled every time I turned the key to unlock the door that led below. That night, as the mop slid across the floor, I noticed something strange. The streak of water wasn't uniform. There were shapes pressed into it, shapes I hadn't made. I stopped, leaning down to look. There were footprints. Large, bare footprints, wet and shining under the light. At first I thought I had tracked them in somehow, but they didn't match the soles of my shoes. They were wider, longer, and the toes splayed like someone had walked barefoot through a puddle. My chest tightened. The prints led further down the corridor, curving around the corner toward the boiler room. I stood still for a long time, trying to convince myself of a reasonable explanation. Maybe a leak had dripped water across the tiles, forming patterns that only looked like prints. Maybe someone had been down here earlier in the evening, though I couldn't imagine why. No one ever came into the basement after dark. Still, the sight of the wet trail pulled me forward. My hand gripped the mop handle so tightly my knuckles ached as I followed the trail. Each step I took echoed against the walls, mixing with the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance. The smell grew stronger the closer I got to the boiler room, damp, metallic like water that had been sitting stagnant for too long. I stopped just short of the door. The last print ended at the threshold. Toes pointed directly at the entrance. The handle glistened with moisture, as though someone had grabbed it with soaking hands only moments ago. My breathing grew shallow. I tried to listen for movement, any sound that would explain who was inside. At first, all I heard was the buzz of the lights overhead, but then came the faintest scrape. It was so soft I thought I imagined it, but it came again, nails dragging lightly across metal. My eyes locked on the seam of the door, as though something might push through. I considered leaving, running back up the stairs and pretending I had never seen any of this. But some foolish curiosity made me reach for the handle. My fingers hovered an inch away, trembling. The scrape from inside grew louder, more insistent, like something dragging itself closer to the door. Before I could touch it, a violent bang shook the frame. It was so sudden and forceful that I stumbled backward, dropping the mop. The sound echoed through the corridor, rattling the light fixtures above. Something massive had slammed against the other side, as if trying to break free. I stood frozen for a second too long, staring at the trembling door, half expecting it to burst open. My throat felt tight, and I realized I couldn't swallow. The air felt damp and heavy, pressing down on my chest. The silence that followed was worse than the bang, an awful stillness that seemed to stretch on forever. Then, just as I turned to flee, I caught sight of a thin line of water trickling out from under the door. It spread slowly across the tiles, curving around my shoes like it was alive, like it was reaching for me. That was enough. I ran, my footsteps echoing wildly in the corridor as the mop lay abandoned on the wet floor behind me. For the first time since I started this job, I didn't finish my shift, and as I slammed the basement door shut at the top of the stairs, I could still hear the faint sound of water dripping below, steady and deliberate, like a clock counting down. The following night I came back, though every part of me wanted to stay home. I told myself I needed the money, that whatever had happened in the basement was nothing more than faulty pipes and my imagination. But as I walked into the building and flicked on the dim light of the lobby, I felt the same heavy silence pressing against me. It wasn't the type of quiet that comforted, it was suffocating, like I was intruding in a place I didn't belong. I decided I wouldn't go anywhere near the basement that night. I started instead with the upper floors, moving from one office to the next. The air felt different up there, colder, though the heating was always left on overnight. My breath didn't fog, but the chill raised goosebumps along my arms. As I cleaned, I tried to focus on ordinary things, the squeak of the broom, the steady swish of the mop, the smell of floor polish mixing with dust. I told myself if I kept my head down and finished quickly, I could get through the shift without letting my mind play tricks. But when I moved into one of the corner offices, I noticed the door hanging slightly open. That shouldn't have been possible. I remembered locking every door the night before, as I always did. Inside, the chairs had been dragged away from the desks and pushed against the far wall. They weren't stacked or scattered. They were arranged neatly in a row, all facing the same empty corner. The sight of it made my stomach twist. It was too deliberate, too precise, like someone had prepared for an audience that had never shown up. I swept the floor quickly, forcing myself not to look at the chairs again. The lights above me buzzed loudly, then flickered out for a split second. In that short burst of darkness, I thought I saw a figure seated in one of the chairs, its head tilted down, hands folded neatly in its lap. When the light snapped back on, the chair was empty. My heart skipped, and sweat prickled the back of my neck. I tried to laugh it off under my breath, though no sound came. I grabbed my cart and wheeled it back into the hall, but when I looked down, my blood ran cold. The trail of wet footprints was there again. They weren't faint this time. They glistened fresh and bright under the fluorescent glow. Each one pointed directly toward me. I froze, staring at them. The prints stretched down the hallway, smearing slightly as though the figure that left them had slowed its pace. They led all the way up to where I stood. The last footprint was right at my feet, toes pressed into the tile as if whoever left it had stopped to stand inches away. My hands trembled so badly that I almost lost my grip on the broom. The hallway stretched silent in both directions, no sound but the ringing in my ears. I stepped back slowly, forcing my eyes to scan every shadow. The prints were still wet enough to reflect the overhead light, as though they had been made only seconds ago. But there was no one else on the floor. I was alone. I pushed my cart quickly to the stairwell and forced myself to keep moving. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't quit. I couldn't afford to. I tried to calm my racing heart by focusing on the rhythm of my footsteps up the next flight, counting them one by one. But with each step, I felt as though something was following close behind, matching my pace. I refused to look back. On the next floor, I found another office with its door ajar. The chairs inside had been rearranged again. This time, they weren't lined against the wall. They were spread in a half circle around a single desk chair that had been pulled to the center of the room. It looked like a stage had been set, like the desk chair was meant for someone to sit while the others watched. I felt sick. As I backed away, I noticed the faint smear of water along the carpet, leading out of the office and into the hall. It glistened faintly under the light, almost like a trail marking the path of something unseen. I turned, nearly stumbling over my own feet as I rushed back toward the stairwell. My breath came fast and shallow, echoing too loud in the emptiness. Before I reached the door, the lights flickered again, longer this time. In the dark, I felt a presence pass by me, the faint brush of air against my arm, as though something had just walked past. When the lights came back, the footprints were there again, leading ahead of me, guiding me back toward the basement stairs. I froze at the top step, staring down into the darkness below. The wet trail shined faintly on the concrete, waiting. By the third night, I could barely bring myself to unlock the doors. My hand trembled around the keys, and the hollow echo that greeted me when I stepped inside made my skin crawl. The building felt alive, as though it knew I was coming back despite the warnings I had already seen. The air seemed colder than before, not in a physical sense, but in a way that made my stomach knot and my mind scream at me to leave. Yet my body moved forward, driven by necessity and a stubborn thought that maybe, if I finished another night, everything would go back to normal. I avoided the basement completely. I told myself there was no reason to go near it, that I could work around the lower floors and finish up quickly. But even away from the basement, the strangeness followed me. The lobby looked wrong the moment I entered. The chairs that had been in the offices the night before were now neatly arranged in the middle of the open space. Not against a wall this time, not in rows, but in a perfect circle. In the very center sat my cleaning supplies mop, broom, and bucket placed as if someone had carried them there and carefully set them down. I stopped dead in my tracks. I hadn't touched them since the last shift. I had left them tucked in the supply closet upstairs, exactly where they always stay. The circle of chairs stood silent and symmetrical, the bucket in the center catching the overhead light and shining as if it were on display. My chest tightened. I felt like I was staring at some kind of ritual, though I didn't understand the meaning. I forced myself to step closer, though each movement felt wrong, like I was disturbing something that wasn't meant to be touched. I grabbed the bucket handle and pulled it free from the circle, dragging my things away as quickly as I could. As soon as I moved them, the silence deepened. It was a silence so complete that I could hear the faint thud of my heart in my ears. Then I noticed the reflections. The glass doors at the front of the lobby caught the scene behind me, multiplying it endlessly in the night outside. Rows and rows of circles stretched outward, reflections bouncing off each other, making it look like there were countless gatherings of chairs, countless silent arrangements waiting in the dark. I turned my head quickly, not wanting to see, and for a fraction of a second in the corner of my vision, I swore something tall moved between the reflections. I gripped the mop handle so tightly my hand hurt. I told myself to keep working, to just push through the night, but dread seeped into every corner of my mind. I cleaned quickly, refusing to look toward the glass again. When I finally forced myself to glance back, the words froze me where I stood. On the glass, smeared into the fog by wet, human-like hands, was a warning. Letters formed with streaks of water, uneven but readable under the fluorescent lights. "Don't clean tonight." I stood staring at it until my knees felt weak. My thoughts twisted in circles, trying to explain how the words had appeared. The glass was dry when I entered, and I had been in the lobby the entire time. There had been no sound of movement, no footsteps, nothing. And yet the warning was there, dripping faintly as though the hand that wrote it had vanished seconds before. I thought about leaving right then, abandoning the shift and never coming back. But the thought of walking back into the open night, past the glass doors and the endless reflections, made my skin crawl even more. It felt like whichever way I chose, I wasn't safe. I wheeled my supplies toward the stairwell, desperate to keep moving. But at the edge of the hallway, I noticed it again. A dark wetness shimmered faintly under the light, spreading into faint shapes. The footprints, they trailed out of the lobby, as if whoever had written on the glass had walked away only moments before. I crouched down against my better judgment, staring at the nearest print. The water glistened fresh, so fresh it dripped at the edges, slowly spreading across the tiles. My reflection rippled in the wet surface, warped and distorted, almost like I was looking at another face instead of my own. The trail led deeper into the building, winding out of sight into the darkened hallway. I told myself I wouldn't follow, that I wasn't that foolish. But I couldn't ignore the way the prints shined, almost glowing faintly as though guiding me forward. When I looked back at the glass one last time, the message was gone. The door was dry and spotless, as if nothing had ever been written there. The only trace left was the sound of dripping water, steady and rhythmic, echoing faintly down the hall where the footprints waited. I tried to convince myself I would ignore the trail, but my routine always pulled me back toward the places I didn't want to go. By the time I had finished with the upper floors, there was nothing left except the basement. The idea of stepping down there again made my stomach twist, but my mind kept whispering that maybe if I just finished, maybe if I ignored whatever games were happening in this building, I could go home and never think about it again. I wheeled my cart slowly toward the stairs, each creak of the wheels echoing too loudly against the walls. The door to the basement groaned when I opened it, as if it had been waiting. The air that rushed up from below was colder than before, sharp enough to sting my throat. I hesitated on the top step, gripping the railing so tightly my knuckles ached. My eyes followed the gleam of water on the concrete steps. The footprints were back, leading down into the shadows. They didn't wander or smear this time. They descended with purpose, each one clear and deliberate. I forced myself to go down, each step louder than the last. The sound of dripping water echoed from somewhere deep in the basement, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. The footprints glistened faintly, carrying me past the storage rooms, past the endless pipes, toward the boiler room door. But something was different. The door was no longer closed. It was wide open, yawning like a dark mouth waiting for me to step through. I froze at the threshold, staring into the blackness. The air smelled of rust, mold, and something else I couldn't place, something foul, like stagnant water that had been sealed away for too long. I raised my flashlight, and its weak beam cut across the room. My breath caught. Against the far wall, lined in perfect rows, stood dozens of mops, brooms, and buckets. They were upright, leaning neatly as if waiting for someone to claim them. But these weren't mine. They were old, rusted, and warped with age. Their wood handles were cracked, their metal bands streaked with rust, their buckets corroded and broken. Some looked decades old, coated with a thin film of dust and mold. I stepped inside, each breath shallow, my chest tight with dread. My light trembled across the collection. It felt like I had stumbled into a graveyard of tools, abandoned by others who had worked here long before me. But the way they were arranged wasn't random. They were too neat, too purposeful. It looked like someone had lined them up carefully, presenting them like relics. My beam drifted higher, across the wall above them, and my throat tightened. Carved deep into the concrete were tally marks, hundreds of them, uneven and jagged, etched by desperate hands. Some were faint, worn down by time, but others were fresh, sharp and raw. The sight made my stomach turn. Each mark seemed to count something, a record of nights, or of people. I moved closer without meaning to, drawn to the endless rows of scratches. My fingers hovered near the wall, almost touching the grooves. That's when I heard it, the soft, unmistakable sound of footsteps, wet footsteps, moving slowly, each one slapping against the floor with a sticky rhythm. They came from the hallway behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight into the corridor. The beam cut through the dark, but nothing was there. Still, the sound didn't stop. The footsteps grew louder, closer, as if someone invisible was walking steadily toward the room. My light trembled across the doorway, catching only the empty hall. Then the sound stopped. Silence spread through the basement, but it wasn't empty silence. It felt watchful, patient. I tried to steady my breathing, but the air felt thick, almost damp, like I was breathing through water. My ears strained for any sign of movement, any clue as to where the steps had gone. My hand shook so badly the flashlight beam wavered across the floor, and that's when I saw it. The footprints had returned. They were fresh, glistening in the beam, leading straight into the boiler room. They crossed the threshold slowly, one by one, spreading across the floor in front of me. The sound hadn't lied. Something had entered with me. I staggered back toward the wall of tally marks, the old mops looming in the corner of my vision. The fresh prints stopped only a few feet from where I stood, gleaming wet against the concrete. The space between me and them was closing, and yet nothing was visible in the beam of my flashlight. The dripping sound returned, louder now, echoing through the boiler room like water falling into a deep well. It came from everywhere at once, circling me. My hands went numb around the flashlight, and I realized with horror that the last mark on the wall was still damp, as though carved only moments before. The footprints shifted closer. The sound of the wet footsteps filled the room, steady and deliberate, circling me in the dark. My flashlight quivered in my hand, its beam barely strong enough to cut through the damp air. The fresh footprints gleamed on the floor, stopping only a few feet away, yet the space beyond them was empty. Nothing stood there. No shape, no figure, no body to cast the trail. My heart pounded against my ribs as though trying to escape, and my breath came shallow, each inhale heavy with the smell of rot and stagnant water. The boiler room door slammed shut behind me with a metallic crash that echoed through the basement. I spun toward it, my light jerking wildly across the walls. The exit was gone, swallowed by shadow. I ran to it, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. My palms slipped against the damp metal, the slickness of water coating it like sweat. The tally marks on the wall loomed above me, endless rows of scratches carved by unseen hands. I forced myself to turn back, praying that nothing had moved closer. That was when I saw it. In the stuttering flicker of my flashlight, a figure stood in the far corner of the room. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the pipes that ran along the ceiling. Its body was pale and slick, as if carved from waterlogged flesh, glistening in the light. It had no face, only a smooth stretch of skin that dripped steadily onto the floor. The water pooled at its feet, spreading outward in small streams that crept toward the footprints already etched across the concrete. It didn't move, yet every time the light flickered, it seemed to be closer. One moment it was across the room, and the next it stood halfway between us, its towering shape shuddering in the beam. My chest seized, and my body refused to obey my mind's frantic orders to run. I could only stand there, frozen, as the damp air thickened around me. The dripping intensified, each droplet echoing in the silence, until it felt like dozens of clocks were ticking in unison. I glanced at the wall, desperate to look away from the faceless shape. The tally mark swam in my vision. That's when I noticed it. At the very end of the endless rows was a fresh mark. It gleamed wet, water still running down from the groove. My knees weakened. I knew, somehow, that mark hadn't been there before I entered. The footsteps began again, circling me slowly. The sound of bare wet skin slapping against the floor made the hair on my neck rise. I spun in every direction, but the figure didn't move. It remained still, though the steps grew louder. Surrounding me, my flashlight dimmed, sputtered, and for a heartbeat the room went black. In that instant of darkness, the air shifted at the back of my neck. Something was breathing behind me. The light came back with a weak glow, but the figure was gone. The room looked empty, though the wet prints now surrounded me on all sides. My bucket tipped over by itself, spilling dirty water across the floor. The stream joined with the other puddles, spreading toward my shoes, until the cold seeped into the soles. My reflection rippled faintly in the liquid, only it wasn't my reflection. The face staring back at me was smooth, faceless, pale, dripping like the figure in the corner. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. My chest heaved as I pressed against the wall of tally marks. The scratching grooves bit into my back. I could feel the dampness clinging to them. Something sharp pressed against my spine, like the tip of a nail dragging slowly. It felt deliberate, carving, etching. I jerked forward, but the pressure remained, following me no matter how I moved, as if invisible hands were already marking me into the wall. The light flickered again, dimming to nothing more than a weak pulse. In the failing glow, the figure reappeared. It stood only a few feet away now, towering, faceless, dripping. Its body leaned toward me, its head tilting in a way that made my stomach churn. Water ran steadily from its limbs, pooling into the floor, flooding toward me. The flashlight died completely. Darkness swallowed me whole. In that black silence, the footsteps stopped. For a single breath, I thought maybe it had vanished. But then I felt it, the damp, icy brush of breath against the back of my neck. A presence towering behind me. Too close, too real. Something dragged across the wall, a fresh line carved into the concrete, etched deep and wet. And in that final moment of silence, I understood. I wasn't working here anymore. I wasn't the janitor. I was only the newest tally mark, another forgotten name carved into the endless count.